It took 2.5 years. When Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, it took 2.5 years before the news reached Galveston, Texas. The Emancipation Proclamation was a strategic move for the Union to win the Civil War. It declared that all slaves in the Confederate States would be freed. So the Union Army traveled to each of these states to make this declaration. Texas was the last state of the Confederacy with institutional slavery. On June 19, 1865, U.S. General Gordon Granger read General Order Number 3 to the people of Galveston, Texas. He announced, "The people of Texas are informed that in accordance with a proclamation from the Executive of the United States, all slaves are free." The celebration, the feast day commemorating this event, is called Juneteenth. In 2021, President Biden made it a national holiday. This was the culmination of the effort of a little old lady from Fort Worth, Texas, named Opal Lee. Miss Lee wanted Juneteenth to become a national holiday. 6 years ago, at the age of 89, Miss Lee decided to walk from Fort Worth, Texas to Washington, D.C. at age 89. She walked to gather signatures to petition for a national holiday called Juneteenth. Miss Lee walked in 2.5-mile increments along the way to commemorate that it took 2.5 years for the Emancipation Proclamation to travel to Texas. She said, "I decided that maybe if a little old lady, 89 years old, in tennis shoes walked from Fort Worth to Washington, somebody might pay attention." And indeed, people did. She gathered 1.5 million signatures and convinced Congress and Mr. Biden to make Juneteenth an official national holiday. Today, she is 95 years old and still feels like she's got something to give. She's working to build a museum on the history of Juneteenth on her family property. Now, this property was hard-won. When her family first moved to Fort Worth, Texas, when she was only 12 years old, and they had bought a house, a white mob of 500 people surrounded their home. They raided their home, dragged out all their belongings from their house, and burned them. The people of Fort Worth, Texas dared the Lee family to stay. Opal Lee said her mother refused to leave. She didn't say a word about what happened, but she just kept working untiringly till she could buy another house. And it is on this family property that the Museum to Juneteenth will be erected. This story has me thinking about good news and bad news. When the news of emancipation reached Texas, who thought it was good news and who thought it was bad news? When Opal Lee's family moved to Fort Worth, Texas, who thought it was good news and who thought it was bad news? When Juneteenth became a national holiday, who thought that was good news and who thought it wasn't newsworthy at all? I ask the same questions of the gospel reading today. Who thought it was good news and who thought it was bad news? We are told that when the Gerasenes saw the man who had been possessed by a legion of demons, saw that he was healed and in his right mind, we are told that they were seized with a great fear. Definitely not good news to them. I think about this man who was healed, and I think about his life before. In ancient times, demon possession was seen as a cause of a variety of things. Sometimes possession was seen as a result of sin. But Jesus usually rejected this idea. Today we hear that the man was possessed by a legion. He did not give himself a name, he gave himself a number. A legion was a unit of the Roman army numbering between 3,000 to 6,000 soldiers. I ask you to pause a moment to consider being surrounded, plagued by 3,000 to 6,000 demons. Now it doesn't seem so odd that he skulked about the gravestones outside of polite society. Consider what torture it must have been for him to be seized by the demons who threw him to the ground at a whim. No wonder he tore away all his clothes. We are told that the citizens of Gerasa would shackle him, chain him, and keep him under guard so that they could feel safe. But when Jesus freed this man, they felt afraid. Deep in their hearts, they did not want this man free. They had relied on the structure of bondage to give themselves a peace of mind. As long as the problem was out there, they didn't have to think about the problem in here. Legion played a very important role in their society to keep it orderly, because he became the scapegoat for the people's disorder. He carried the baggage of 3,000 to 6,000 souls. But now, he was in his right mind, and the minds of the townspeople became full of dread. Jesus' gospel is about dismantling the structures of bondage, to proclaim good news to those who are in prison. But not everyone would receive that as good news. Those who benefit from the structures can grow very afraid. And terrible things can happen when we are very afraid. One time, after hearing this gospel reading, a hedge fund manager came to me and complained. He said, "What about the pigs? What about the pig industry in Gerasa? What about those farmers?" And I thought, what about them? What about the cotton and the tobacco? Who's gonna pick that now? What about those poor plantation owners? The interesting thing is that the Gerasenes did not complain about the pigs. They actually understood the real importance of what had happened. Freedom for the man who was possessed meant the dismantling of structures that kept oppression locked in and kept the denial locked in, the denial of their privileged and tidied world. The townspeople knew what was going on, and so they begged Jesus to leave. The man formerly known as Legion begged also, but to leave with Jesus. Jesus instead told him to stay and declare the gospel to everyone. His good news. So now he was a disciple, someone who followed Jesus. Now he was an apostle, someone sent by Jesus. And now he was an evangelist, someone who proclaimed the good news he found in his freedom through Jesus Christ. And he was supposed to proclaim this good news of freedom in the midst of people who were afraid, who would rather that he didn't proclaim, who would rather that he shut up, who would resent his continued presence there as a reminder of their fears. I imagine if he were to move back into town and actually into a house away from the gravestone, I wonder what would have happened. Would 500 townspeople gather around his house, drag everything out and burn it because they were afraid? I imagine if that were the case, then he might have taken a cue from courage to rebuild, to not be chased away. And like Opal Lee's family, build that house again. Stay there, as Jesus said, and announce with every brick he relayed to build his house the good news that is Jesus Christ. Layer by layer, brick by brick, this freedom promised, this good news that is for him good news. And this is what he would proclaim.